What's happening? What's happening? What's happening, blues people, blues scholars, blues intellects, blues musicians, African American folklorists, indigenous folklorists, and all of the above. Welcome to another episode of not only just the African American folklorists, but the African American folklorists of the month, and the African American folklorist that's going to be featured on our next cover. I'm speaking with Dr. Shirley Moody-Turner, founder, co-director of the Center for Black Digital Research, the founder, co-director for Cooper Dubois mentoring program we're going to get into, because I've been doing a lot of, I don't want to say research, but I've been interrogating our elder intellect, W.E.B. Du Bois. So I want to talk about that. Associate Professor of English and African American Studies, affiliate faculty and university libraries at Penn State. Her titles include, but are not limited to, the African American Literature in Transition, 1900 to 1910, Black Folklore and the Politics of Racial Representation, which is where I met her. And we're going to get into that because, believe it or not, in my quest to find Black folklorists, African American folklorists, folklorists of color, when I couldn't find any and I did a different kind of search, Dr. Moody is the first one I found and interviewed, which kind of launched this platform. But we'll get into that. And right now, the title that is out and can be purchased, The Portable Anna Julia Cooper, a Penguin Classic, which is a collection of essential writings from the iconic foremother of Black women's intellectual history, feminism, and activism, who helped pave the way for modern social justice movements like Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name. Let's welcome Dr. Shirley Moody-Turner. Was that too long?
That was very nice. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here with you today. Thank you.
No, thank you. As I was saying, so as I shared in the opening, you actually were the first African American folklorist I had the pleasure and honor to highlight an interview as that part of this journey took place.
Wow, that's wonderful. That's quite an honor for me. I'm I'm honored.
So it was Black folklore and the politics of racial representation. That's what introduced me to your work. So now, some years later, we are talking about the Center for Black Digital Research. We are talking about the Cooper Dubois mentoring program, and we're also talking about the portable Anna Julia Cooper. Wait, I know I'm missing something. I know there's something I'm missing that you did that we spoke about.
What else? What else? The Black Women's Organizing Archive, and the African American Literature in Transition, that came out maybe 2 years ago as well.
Wow. So I guess the first thing I should ask you is, when are you resting?
It's funny you should ask that. I've been reading Tricia Hersey's Rest is Resistance, a manifesto. And so I've actually been recommitting myself to, to finding time to rest, to taking downtime, to taking real breaks. And I can talk more about that as we continue, but I think, it's been nice to get to a point where I can reflect on what all this work means to the way we live our lives, to our health, our wellness, to taking good care of ourselves. Because if we don't do that and do it for each other, then what are we doing this work for? So
Right.
I've been trying to recommit to a politics of rest. So that's a good question.
Right. Well, because as someone who is doing the work and understanding that there is just time consuming to see all the things that, and I have one of the reasons why we celebrate you and intellectuals and scholars like yourself, because you guys finish the projects. Everybody has an idea, but you're finishing these things,
Yeah.
right?
Well, sometimes it takes, long timelines. It's funny because you talk to journalists and they're like, you academics, take you 2 years, 3 years to put out an article. So I guess it's all just different timelines.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
yeah.
So right. So first, I have to say, just in event, if anyone is like, why is this guy, has bookshelves that are empty? I cannot think about. I'm trying to remember this guy's name. I forgot the great. I don't know, but he was referenced in The Wire as someone who had all these books but never read the books. I read the books. We just moved and I'm fixing my office, but I had to get on with Dr. Moody-Turner, so I just didn't have time to set up my space. All right. So if anyone is wondering why my shelves are empty and then there's this image hanging here that's not hanging up, that's why. So now we're going to get into your work, which I have to show them. So now, before we talk about the actual project, right?
Okay.
Let's break down a couple of technical terms for the lay persons.
Okay.
Right. The first thing I would like to break down is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but do you straddle between history and folklore? Is it interdisciplinary for you? Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I did my graduate work in African American literature and folklore studies. But there wasn't a degree in African American literature and folklore studies. There was a degree in English language and literature. So my degree is in literature, but my work is in African American literature and folklore. So I've always worked between those two fields, and I have to be honest, I'm just gonna say I made the rookie mistake and let my battery run low. So I have a very, very wonderful partner who has come up to plug me in. Um, and this is how it goes. So but my work is in literature and in folklore studies. So I always try to make the distinction that I do folklore studies. I study how folklore operates, how the discipline of folklore emerged, what folklore means in different contexts. And I have done work, folklorist work out in the field, interviewing people, and have directed lots and lots of projects of students doing that kind of work. I worked in oral history projects. So I kind of cross disciplines, I think. I don't know that there's a really neat way to to kind of categorize it. I think I've kind of, made my own way.
Yeah, I dig it, and I really appreciate that, because at least for me, African American studies, literature for that matter, English, if you will, but more African American studies, history, sociology, and literature kind of are interdisciplinary with folk studies, with anthropology, right, if you will, and these surveys, which, as you know, you've been here with me before. I'm going to jump around a bit, and when I say surveys, as of now, I'm thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois, who I've been interrogating for some time and having a lot of off camera and off microphone debates with some great folks about this gentleman, and I see that part of one of the projects that you were working on is the Cooper Dubois mentoring program. So, as you know, we're going to jump back and forth. We're going to get back to your story, but I kind of I would like you to tell the audience not just how this program came about, but why were these two iconic Black scholars brought together for this particular program?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. So it was very intentional. So the Cooper Du Bois program is about creating opportunities for historically underrepresented students in graduate studies and higher education. And, a lot of people think of mentoring programs and they think, oh, well, let's provide these students with what they need, to move to the next level. But a lot of the project is really about addressing structural issues, funding issues, opportunity, to make these programs ready for these amazing students. So I looked, I thought about Anna Julia Cooper and W.E.B. Du Bois, two figures who had reached the heights of their academic and intellectual work. And, Du Bois getting his degrees, University of Berlin and then Harvard, Anna Julia Cooper getting her degrees at Oberlin and then the University of Paris Sorbonne. And so these were, these were figures who had done this exemplary work, but they were also figures, especially for me, because I study Cooper and Du Bois, I'm sure too, but for me, especially for Cooper, was someone who was so committed and worked so hard to make sure that there were opportunities for her students, and who had to work what she calls positive discouragement, who had to work against positive discouragement to higher education for Black students in particular. And so, I can talk about this maybe a little more when we get to the book too. But, one of her greatest, what she said was her greatest contribution was creating pathways to Ivy League schools, to top Black colleges and universities for her students at M Street. And when she did that, she was not reappointed as principal of M Street because of that work, And so even as she was, preparing her students and, supporting and encouraging their Black excellence in their placement, she was being, positively discouraged and retaliated against for that work. And so I wanted to recognize what it meant for these two figures to be carrying out that work and for these students to be, beneficiaries of that legacy, and really to recognize that when we say these things, Cooper and Du Bois did this work, but like, what did it mean for them to actually, what did they put at risk to carry out that work? And for these students to have a chance to be part of that was really important.
That was a very interesting point. I'm going to tell you why. I guess sticking with Du Bois and Cooper, and then looking at the bigger picture and collective. Thank you, young man. We're used to celebrating what we believe are the victories that were fought by our predecessors, but not usually aware of the price they had to pay. Right. And I first I want to commend you for just even bringing that up. Right. I would like to know, as a scholar, as a writer, as a professor, how do you even begin to address that part of the process? Right. Like, just for example, Mr. Charles, his last name escapes me right now, but he's one of the original SNCC members and choir members. And I was able to sit and speak with him and his wife. And he shared a story with me and said it's not about, all this other stuff that the you've been talking about. It's about train, not what I've been told about, what I've been told. He said it's about the training, right? The training for the moments that don't necessarily um look like you're sitting on Oprah's couch being interviewed, right? And how you have to deal with those moments that you could be injured, or those moments, whatever that injury could be, physical, financial, or even exiled from a country, right? So could you walk us through how you approach that? Because that's something most Black folk don't get a chance to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think, for a lot of the women that I study, 19th century Black women writers, intellectuals, activists, there's a term which I don't exactly like the way it sounds, but there's a kind of politics of failure. What people might perceive as failure, that they were unable to get their work published, or they were unable to win this lawsuit, or they were unable to achieve this grant. And again, I think it's so important for those moments to make clear the ways in which the systems and the structures are set up, you know, to do that, in the ways in which race and gender, and being honest about the places where we meet those challenges, helps reveal how those systems and structures work and operate. But I think also, I think probably two really critical things is having a clear purpose. Once one gets clear about their purpose, and I'll probably talk about Anna Julia Cooper a lot in this interview, since having finished the book, but then also the edition, and then also working on a biography on her right now. But she was very clear about her purpose. She had a very, very clear purpose. She wanted to, she was committed to education as a means of social change and transformation. And so I think that she was able to see that, because she actually was, when she was on not reappointed as principal of M Street in 1905, 1906, she was actually exiled from, and ended up, or excommunicated, and ended up going to Missouri for 4 or 5 years before she was able to come back and work at M Street, but never again as a principal, only as a teacher. And I think her sense of purpose, her sense of, a spiritual, religious, if you want to call it, imbued sense of purpose and commitment, is one of the things that sustained her in those times. And then I think too, community. And so even when I think about Cooper being quote unquote exiled to Missouri, there were people, and we kind of forget this sometimes, but there were people who were there, who made sure she had employment, she had connections, she had a network, so that she wasn't, even when the powers that be, when she fell out of favor, which of course, we eventually do, there was a community and a network to be there to support her through that. And so I think it's just so important, having a clear sense of purpose, and knowing that as circumstances change, that purpose is still there to guide, and then having a network and a community that extends beyond the kinds of institutions, that we might be part of.
So with that, now you know what I have to ask you. How did we get to the legendary Cooper? What led you to her?
That's a very good question too. They're all going to be good questions. So, interestingly, so I was actually introduced to Cooper through the Schomburg 19th century Black women writers series. Put out these volumes. I think it's actually right here. Put out these small volumes of 19th century Black women writers' work, and the one for Cooper, Mary Helen Washington, one of the kind of foundational figures of Black feminist criticism, literary criticism, wrote the introduction for the Anna Julia Cooper, A Voice from the South edition. And when I read her introduction, I was just amazed. I was amazed by the way she talked about Cooper, the things that she shared in terms of, how Cooper negotiated all of the challenges that she was up against, the ways in which she articulated and gave voice and named a Black feminist position already in the 19th century. And then especially what she said was, Cooper had dedicated her life to education of the underprivileged or to the most neglected people. And there was something about that just struck me as a graduate student starting off and someone who was really is devoted to teaching and education. So it was Mary Helen's introduction. Before I even got to Anna Julia Cooper's words, it was her introduction that really, brought me in and opened it up for me. And I think it's just so important because we think about the work, like the editorial apparatus and that work that literary scholars and historians do in like introducing us to new works. And it's so important, it's so important because that was, I didn't come to A Voice from the South. I came to Mary Helen's introduction. And so that's how I got into to Anna Julia Cooper. And then, of course, I started reading her work and, was just struck by how contemporary, even though it was her language, she loves kind of rhetorical play, long winding sentences with these like ironic turnarounds. And, so her language was very, elevated and sophisticated. And it was also spoke to and named things that were happening in the 19th century that still felt very present when I was reading it. And so I think that was my entry into Cooper. And then I think the reason I started writing about her and wanted to do the edition really was because when I was doing the work on the first book, Black Folklore and the Politics of Racial Representation, I came across two pieces, a letter and then a short essay that Cooper had written on Black folklore. And that was always so surprising to me because I was like, Anna Julia Cooper, you've got this picture of this Victorian, very proper, scholar. And then I was like, what is she doing hanging around with these folklorists in Hampton, Virginia? And so that started it kind of opened a whole new world for me because then I was like, well, I only know her in such a limited way. That's what I realized. I just knew her in such a limited way. And so I really wanted to know, like, what else don't we know about her? If she's talking to these folklorists and being so bold and calling out the founder of the American folklore, or the one of the founders and the secretary of the American Folklore Society, William Wells Newell, calling him out and telling the folklorists that they need to be true to themselves and look for the folklore that resides closest to them in their lives, their communities, their families. I was like, what else is she doing? What else is she up to? And that started me on this whole journey of kind of pulling together her scattered archives from across different repositories.
Wow. So is it safe to say that she was of the, if not the first, of the first African-American scholars to address how or give a suggestion to how the methods should be applied to the documentation of a people, particularly her own people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think she was one of the early. I think we're starting to kind of recover her as one of the early, Black folklore studies scholars. As we put together, as we work on putting together our own genealogy and history of African American and Black folklore studies, we start to see that people like Anna Julia Cooper, who wouldn't even register, in a kind of American folklore studies, they might not even register, or even the Hampton Folklore Society, that these figures were always already thinking about the importance, the politics, the significance of the work that they were doing, you know. And so she's really early in addressing the Hampton folklorists and saying, you know, be attentive to the work that lies nearest to you, like the culture, the customs, the traditions that lie nearest to you. Do not let these dominant cultural ideas impact you in such a way that you start to judge your own traditions by that lens. Like, who else is saying, you know? And so, you know, so really being attentive to that, and telling them not to, you know, try to imitate these white customs and traditions. And also being, you know, she's also critical, like, of the ways in which Black folklore and folklorists is being dismissed. She's like, you know, people say Black folklore is imitative, but what culture is not imitative, you know? And so kind of calling out some of these, you know, stereotypical approaches that were being used to dismiss African American folklore, but also African American folklorists. So, you know, when she's talking to the Folklore Society, there's people like Robert Russa-Moton who are already theorizing about Black folklore. He's theorizing about it too. And so, you know, I think they just recognized that they were thinking about it in ways that couldn't even be apprehended by, you know, some of the, you know, white folklore societies or some of the mainstream figures. And they created their own, you know, intellectual community around its significance.
Wow, their own space. I'm stuttering because what I'm receiving is they at a time when this is not necessarily popular. The story of Black, in a way that's anti-primitive, if you will. And so they're not at the top of the popularity list. So instead of trying to force feed someone to understand what they're saying, they just say, let's take this over here to this space and make sure that we do this. Is this what you're telling us?
Yeah, I mean, I think she was definitely writing back against the ways in which two things, the ways in which Black folk and folklore was being understood in this evolutionary model, like, you know, and to be used to make all kinds of justifications about segregation and Jim Crow, and, you know, that like, okay, well, you have folklore, Black folklore, African folklore down here at the bottom. And then you kind of evolve and you move up the ladder until you get to a certain point, and then you maybe even evolve out of folklore, you know. And I think Cooper was calling all that out. Like, no, that's just not the way it is. And I think she was critical of folklore, and then also critical of a practice that wouldn't see African Americans as trained scholars, intellectuals, and folklorists. So Alice Bacon, actually the founder of one of the white Northern woman who comes down and founds the Hampton Folklore Society at Hampton, Virginia, you know, she says in a meeting to the American Folklore Society, there's not one trained folklorist among us. You know, and she's got Robert Russa-Moton and Daniel Webster Davis, and so, you know, there. And but Robert Russa-Moton is very much aware of how folklore operates and Black cultural traditions operate, but she couldn't kind of see him as a trained folklorist. And so I think Cooper is calling both of those two dynamics out. And then I think she also, elsewhere, she says, you know, there's material here to furnish epics. You know, if we look at our own stuff, there's this epic struggle, there's these heroic battles, there's deep inner life and stories. And so I think she's saying that, you know, let's spend time in our own materials, because we have the stories here that really, you know, tell what this struggle has been and is about.
So I'm going to try to ask this question as open-ended as possible, because I would like you to go into extreme detail.
Okay.
Because and just tell me if I'm wrong. You don't even have to tell me if I'm right. Just give us the story, because just based on the work that you do and how you title it, if you will, or describe it. Is it safe to say that you connect to Miss Cooper based on those two, well, three, right? We're talking about an intellect, a scholar, that's two, a woman, a Black woman, and then all of the above with the skills of a professor, historian, and a folklorist. So you're seeing these things in real time. Am I somewhere in the ballpark here?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I do, and I think more so even now, I think as I'm writing the biography, I'm starting to really, really explore, what it is what drew me to her, what called me to write this biography. And I think she lights the way in many ways for me. I see someone who was um, a Black woman intellectual and educator, and how did she make that way? And what did that again, I always ask this question, like, what did that really, really mean, to do this work? What did it mean when she showed up at Oberlin, Ohio in 1884, in the middle of Lorain County, Ohio, off the Lake Erie, and this wooded place, like, what did it mean for her in this place that had an activist history and background, but, was still, I'm sure, a difficult transition for a Black woman coming from North Carolina. Um, and so I keep thinking about those things, and what is it, um, you know, what is the interiority, and trying to get at something. One of the challenges, I think, is that you see these narratives, even with Cooper, and I've participated in this as well, but you see these narratives start to get very fixed. It's like, she was born in North Carolina. She did these three things, educational steps, and her was a fourth Black woman to earn the PhD, getting her degree at the Sorbonne, and died in 1964. And so the narrative starts to get fixed. And it's important. It's an important narrative, and that's our first level of kind of sharing the information. But I think part of it now is like peeling back and saying, like, but how did they deal with the day-to-day, struggles and challenges? What were some of the really inventive, innovative strategies that they came up with to navigate these spaces? One of the things I've been so surprised to find, and this is maybe this is, when you write a biography, when you write history, you always have to acknowledge that you're writing it from wherever you're at in that moment,
Right.
your contemporary moment, but also personally, intellectually, where you're at that moment. And Cooper talks in one of her pieces from her scrapbook about, it's an obituary actually for her students, some of her female students who have passed away. And she says, I wish they had had more joy. And I hate to think about them being kind of overworked by this system, and if that had anything to do with these students who had died too young and too early. And that's one of the things that we don't see in Cooper typically. Nobody talks about Cooper celebrating Black joy and rest, and not getting, overworked by this machine age ethos, she calls it. And so I think there are ways in which I find what it means to be a Black intellectual as a woman, to challenge, to write, to articulate, to name, but then also how to create communities to take care of ourselves and each other. So I do think, yes, I do think there are ways in which I've definitely have found someone who I see, you know, making a way where where there really was barely a way made yet. And that resonates for me.
Wow, I dig it. So talk to us about, there you go, this book, before, because you're writing a biography now, but
Mhm.
this is what kind of created that biography, or am I wrong?
No, so this is, I had wanted to do, I started working in the Moreland Spingarn Research Center, and seeing Cooper's papers, spending time with them, and really wanted to see, both to see them digitized and made available and more easily accessible. And so that was actually part one of the project. Is I got together with a good friend, Adrina Eiffel, and we went to Lopez Matthews, then digital production specialist at the Moreland, and Joellen Elbashir. And we said, could we digitize Anna Julie Cooper's papers? I know you all are doing all this work. Can we like bump Cooper, And so we talked with them, and we were planning a big Douglas Day celebration. And so, we knew that we would be able to get people to really engage with her papers if we could kind of move her up in the queue or move her into the queue for having her work digitized. And so Moreland was, like, yes, that's great. Let's do it. So we collaborated with Lopez Matthews and McKinney Johnson and had her papers digitized, and then did Douglas Day and got all kinds of people involved in transcribing them, from the AKAs to former Dunbar High School, or current, actually at the time, Dunbar High School students, came out, Howard students, Penn State students, organized the project and then got involved in transcribing her work. So that was fabulous. But the digitizing and the print, there's such a dynamic relationship between the two, because when you digitize, then you want to see it in print. And when you get it in print, you're like, but there's so much more that we couldn't fit in the book. We want to see more digitized. So this is this back and forth relationship. So out of that kind of emerged the edition. And it really was, the edition had almost a lot of the materials from Howard, from Moreland, but also from other repositories, Oberlin, Duke, UMass Amherst. So we brought together her scattered papers, some of which were in W.E.B. Du Bois's papers, and some of which were in the alumni files at Oberlin. And so we brought those together, and it was really, the other piece that kind of motivated it was that we knew A Voice from the South is the critical kind of grounding work, Cooper's grounding work. And so we obviously wanted that to be in the edition, but we knew that Cooper also, and this goes back to your first question, we knew that she had done so much more that, had been disappeared or didn't get attention. And so I used Kevin Young's formulation of a shadow book to think about, he calls it the African-American literature denied existence, the books that we don't have, the lost books, the removed books. And so there were so many shadow books in her archive. Wow. So part one is A Voice from the South. Part two is, this is fascinating. So she had an outline for a book simply called On Education in her papers at Moreland. And it had 11 pieces that she presumably wanted to include in a collection of her writings. But we don't have that book. That book, as far as I could tell, was never published. So we pulled together all of the pieces that would have gone into the book that she proposed. Wow. And that's part two of the edition. Part three so a little bit later in life, she's still writing. She's still really active. She's trying to get her writings published in the Crisis. Some she does, some she doesn't. But she publishes a lot of work in the local DC newspapers. And so part three, and then she clips them all and collects them in a scrapbook, which was called The 51st. And it's a story. The 51st is a story of industrial capitalism and this rise of Standard Oil, and Cooper pastes her articles like right over that narrative. She's like, yeah, I'm gonna take that over. So we pulled together all the articles from that scrapbook and published those as part three. Part four are correspondences, some of which I think almost 30 correspondences between Anna Julie Cooper and W.E.B. Du Bois. A lot of people don't know that they continued to communicate throughout pretty much their entire lives. So we brought together those, and they really document the kinds of issues that these two intellectual giants are kind of parsing out in some really nitty-gritty things about well, are you going to publish this or are you not going to publish this? Or are you going to have your conferences, during the school year when teachers can't go, or are you going to have them in the summer? So, there's some really nitty gritty things that they're parsing out, but that are important, to how, the issues that people had to navigate on the day to day. And then some other correspondences as well. And then part 5 is additional writing. So some of her poetry, Cooper wrote a lot of poetry, most of which she never published, but that is really a lot of it's commemorative poetry, little bits and pieces about her family and her dear friends. And some of her other writings, like her letters to the Hampton Folklore Society and her article to the Hampton Folklore Society. So just brought those together to kind of round out the picture of her.
Well, I have a couple of quick questions. Because just listening to what you're saying, there's just so many things I have to ask. But the first one I want to ask, since I'm gonna write, hold on, let me just write this down so I don't forget. Okay, so her and W.E.B. Du Bois, and through my studies of him and my small understandings, because most of the things I've learned about her is following your work. So I haven't had a chance to really dive into getting a full understanding, but a basic. Is it safe? So it's kind of in parts is this question. Is it safe to say their trajectory and evolution of ideology mirror each other, maybe?
That's a good question, and that's actually one of the questions I've really grappled with because, he doesn't publish some of her later works in the crisis. They're really, they share, I think, they're definitely on the same side, like they're on the same side. But, I was trying to follow, like, why did he not publish some of her later works? Some of them are just short, letters where she's critiquing something, or, one she really wanted to publish a series of biographical sketches of Charlotte Fortune Grimke, which is so fascinating because there's like a new book on the Grimke family that's just coming out.
I need that
But
book.
yeah, she knew this. She saw this. She's like, this family is really, really important. And I don't know, I don't know. Some of it was, he said some of it was logistics, like, well, we just can't publish a series over a number of issues. It doesn't do well. So I'm not 100% sure where they kind of diverged. But I think they do share, commitments to, to Black social justice issues through education, through intellectual critique, through publication. So I think that she, I don't know, sometimes she was a little critical. She felt that, if education wasn't at the forefront, that none of the other measures, and even voting, or, even activism, or even economic approaches wouldn't be successful unless there was this kind of intersectional approach. So I'm not 100% sure. I think that's a great project for someone, is to and a few people have, kind of traced their where they kind of diverge and intersect a little bit more in more detail.
Okay. Well, I was asking because one of the things I was interrogating, quantifying, and qualifying on W.E.B. Du Bois is this concept and ideology of Black elitism, which kind of mirrors white elitism to a degree. But then, as harsh as I was on on Mr. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois, if you will, like Miss Cooper, they're both in the category of firsts. So when you're in the category of first, and then you see this trajectory, you see a lot of evolved beliefs based on experience. So I was just wondering how her views evolved, and if they were, if they were could be considered, I don't say reflective of his movements. At the same time, and this is going into my next question, the term feminism. I don't even know if I really want to ask of her journey in reflection of his, because am I negotiating her achievements by doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think she stands on her own. You know, I think she stands on her own in terms of, and I actually don't, you know, it's interesting because I don't even know if an evolutionary approach to her thinking captures, because her articulation in A Voice from the South is so sophisticated,
Mm,
you know, and she's so attentive to the politics of race, class, gender, sexuality. She's already, I mean, it's one of the most sophisticated, you know, fully developed statements of Black feminism. And so I think that becomes in some ways foundational for the ways in which she moves, you know, um, moves through space and her intellectual kind of shifts and where she's putting her attention. But I think the foundation was already set. What's surprising to me is just how she was able to come to such a sophisticated analysis so early. And there's a grad student I've been working with, Kevin Cedeno Pacheco, who has done this amazing work, really being attentive to, you know, what classes was she taking?
hmm.
What did she study when she was at St. Augustine's, or then when she went to Oberlin? And, you know, what professors did she have? And I think Cooper always had a kind of oppositional position. So I think she was always going, even as she was learning, you know, or taking classes about the classics or democracy or the nature of, you know, reason. I think she was learning and questioning all of that through her own experience.
Hmm.
So I think if she was having classes where, you know, she might have Western thinkers on liberty, or, you know, I think she was always questioning that. I'm like, well, you know, I know what my mother's experience was. I know what my experience was. I know what my grandfather's experience was. So how do I take this and ask really critical questions about, what does this mean if, you know, you're talking about the natural rights of man, um, but you know, you're practicing slavery at the same time. So I think as she was going through her education, she was still always bringing her own kind of standpoint um, to that, so that she could say, what does this mean as it's filtered through my experience? And I think that the ability to do that put her in a position to always have very sophisticated analyses, whether she was writing them on a scrap of paper or publishing them, you know, in a beautiful bound book.
So let me ask you, and we'll begin to wrap up, because you know I can ask you questions all day, but I won't do that. Do you think this character trait that you just described of Miss Cooper, it could be applied to just African American folklorists based on our experience on the Americas? So it's like, is that something, how we approach the methods, right? Is that based on experience, and is that unique to Black folklorists?
Yeah. I think, you know, it's so interesting because I think that was what kind of foundational for the first book project. And that's the kind of arc that encompasses all of my work, is like, you know, thinking about how um, Black people have, you know, as a whole, I think have been always creative and critical and reflecting, you know, their experience, you know, in this country through transatlantic slave trade, through the Middle Passage, have always had to be, you know, critical about how this system operates and what the reality is for them, and the dissonance between those two things, you know, and then finding ways to challenge that, but then also again finding these spaces that are not, you know, over determined and circumscribed always, um by that, you know, by that dissonance. So finding places where you can make ways. You know, Houston Baker talks about, you know, one of the features of African American modernism, he calls it, is this ability to navigate the tight spaces. You know, like they finding ways to play the brakes to navigate those tight spaces, right? And so I think I've been, you know, I'm really interested in and fascinated in how that happens from, you know, folklore all the way through, you know, intellectual, like high, you know, high academic, through academic practice as well. That's a pretty important mode of being in learning how to navigate these spaces.
So, in navigating these spaces, what, for the layperson, because one of the major missions of the African American folklorists is to bridge that gap, to connect academia to the layperson, our community scholars, and our independent intellects, if you will. How would you how would you describe the project, the book, and Miss Anna Julia Cooper, so that non-academics and more laypersons and community scholars will engage with your work on and her work, right? Because I believe, based on what I'm learning, what I've read, and what you've told me, there's a place for her to galvanize those that are not necessarily, or don't consider themselves, and they probably are, but just don't know, in academia and in folklore. What can you say to kind of galvanize those folks?
I guess I would say that Anna Julia Cooper is one of our trailblazing foremothers, who was an educator, an activist, an intellectual, a community worker, who figured out how to bridge those gaps to address the day-to-day issues that were affecting Black people. And also to do that in a way that understood that they were part of these larger conversations, national and international, but she was always attentive to, what did this mean for the local community? One of the things I love about her, and that's what I would say in short, and then I would stop because everything else is getting too long, but I would say that. And then I would say, just for these purposes, I would say one of the things I absolutely love is that Cooper started a school, or I'm sorry, she didn't start. She took on the presidency of a group of community schools in DC called Frelinghuysen University, and it was a group of community schools in DC that was founded to provide opportunities for education for working class Black in DC who couldn't go to Howard because they were working during the day, or they didn't have the means. And so she took that on, and she was very adamant that the NAACP and the community should support this Frelinghuysen because it was their own school. And when they didn't get the funding that they needed and they lost accreditation, she moved it into her home in T Street. And she ran classes, administrative units out of her house in T Street in Washington, D.C. And then when she defended her dissertation, she had to do an oral defense in Paris, in France, the height of all kind of European culture and education. And she had to defend her dissertation for this committee in French, and she wrote her oral defense. And when she went back to years later in Frelinghuysen, she translated her oral defense from French into English so she could share it with her students at Frelinghuysen.
Wow.
And so I don't think she, I just love that she didn't see these, stark divides. She felt that at every level, every person could be inspired, encouraged, engaged to pursue that which was most meaningful and important to them, and that her job was to kind of lift up and support that work. And so I think that she has so much to teach us about education, about activism, about thinking across those boundaries of race, gender, class, sexuality. I just think she has a lot to teach us, and she names so many things, so many challenges that we face today. She was already naming them in the 19th century.
Which is, I want to say unbelievable, but it's not. It's just really, really legendary. Is there anything that you wanted me to ask that I did not ask?
No, I would only say that at every level, I've learned more and more that all of these scholarly work, intellectual work is collaborative. And there were a number of amazing graduate students that worked on the edition with me, alongside me, and from whom I learned so much. So Sabrina Evans and Patrick Allen and Katie Warzak and Kevin Cedeno Pacheco and Greg Perot, who translated a lot of the French materials. So I just wanted to really, recognize that, sometimes it's one person whose name goes on the cover, or one person sitting in front of you, but that it really does represent a collective, collaborative effort.
Humbleness and I mean, what else can we ask for? Thank you so much for giving us some time and catching us up on your works.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me back out. I love these conversations. I appreciate everything that you do. It's so important to bring attention to African American folklorists and folklore, and to connect it, even across works that don't immediately look like folklore, to see, how important it is to see those works as part of that larger project. So I really thank you for inviting me back out.